The Pat Kenny Show on News Talk.
With Mater Private Network. During current restrictions, don't ignore your health concerns. Our expert team is ready to help.
With details of the multi-billion Housing for All plan finding their way into various media outlets over the last few weeks, what does the policy programme actually need to deliver in order to properly tackle the housing crisis? I'm joined now by architect and assistant professor at the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy at UCD, Orla Hegarty, and by financial analyst with Yes.ie, Carl Dieter. Good morning and welcome. Carl, we'll start with you first of all. There's a lot of moving the deck chairs around the Titanic, incentives here, incentives there. But if you don't increase supply, you're literally just moving people from place to place.
That's right. And if you look at the number of houses per thousand of inhabitants across the EU, Ireland has about 400. The EU average is 500. So we're that's a good 25% higher than what we have. And if we don't solve that, we're going to have the same problems that other markets have, who are going through similar problems to our own of not having enough housing supply. The other thing is if you look at the vacancy rates, in some counties they're quite high, but in the places with the most compression, they're as low as 1.6%, according to the Geodirectory and Ernst Young report that came out earlier this year.
What should it be in a healthy market?
Well, a healthy market, again, taking a kind of OECD look at it, would be kind of 5-7% around that area. Certainly when you get below 3, you've definitely got problems. And in our capital city, we are half of that. So this is quite a stark situation where you can say that supply won't fix this, but I'll put it this way, you won't fix it without supply either.
Yeah, I mean, with just 1.6% vacancy, it effectively means you've no vacancy, and therefore people have no choice. Something comes on the market, no matter how awful it is, it will find a taker.
And we've seen that before, because you see, like we quite often make these decisions about what we believe the market should be like, or what we believe housing provision to people should be. And that was done before, where we effectively banned bed sits or made it that a lot of them became unviable because we felt they were bad. And what we did is took thousands of homes out of circulation and took people who had low quality housing and pushed them into homelessness. And no one really thought about the view of the people who were living in those homes, whether they'd prefer that decision themselves. So we have to remember that most of the things that solve problems in life, that they're not ideal, and we constantly strive for this ideal, and looking for that perfect mix actually results in far from ideal or perfect outcomes.
OK, now we'll talk in a moment with you, Carl, about how you get up 25% on what we have at the moment in our housing stock to get to that OECD average. But Orla, what does the Minister need to do to boost supply? Because there are all these other gimmicks he's talking about, grants here, grants there, and, it might help the odd derelict house, the odd place over the shop, if they change the rules on that. But it's tinkering.
I think we need to be very careful about supply being painted as a solution to everything. And that's not to say we don't need to build houses. We do. It's that people are saying that if we have more supply, houses will become more affordable. We need an affordability strategy first. There is no point building a lot of houses at the very top end of the market. We see already that the very expensive properties that are being built have high vacancy. So we could be at risk of repeating the same problem again. They're just a different type of ghost estate. The real crisis we have at the moment, I suppose, is twofold. One is about affordability. Whatever we build and whatever we make available has to be affordable to people. The government doesn't have an endless amount of subsidy here, and the idea of subsidising people of 50 or 100,000 for a new house, it doesn't make economic sense really. And the other issue then is capacity. We need to build up our own construction industry so that we can be supplying houses and not on this boom bust cycle where everything crashes and it takes 10 years to recover.
Yeah.
We need.
But isn't the most stable way? Isn't the most stable way of doing that is that local authorities become the developers, and therefore they can guarantee big companies and small, although they have very tedious tendering processes under EU rules. Even though they might have a list of favoured suppliers and so on, the best way to do it is have all the councils building regularly, guaranteeing work for those companies so that the workers will stay. They won't be in and out of the sector. They won't be emigrating to, pastures greener.
Exactly. Yeah. I think EU procurement rules get blamed unfairly a lot of the time. The EU rules are actually very straightforward. In principle, they want to make the market fair so that lots of people can compete, and that brings prices down with good competition. And they want to keep it transparent so that there isn't any corruption in the system. The rules we have that are very protracted, very demanding of previous turnover, and exclude a lot of people and take a long time. That's local practices and procedure. That isn't imposed on us by the EU. So there's a lot of things we could be doing locally to ensure that local building contractors can get into building small schemes for the council or for an AHB or somebody, and that they can then be empowered to recapitalise and get back and do some private development themselves. So I think we need to start by thinking, where do we want the future sector to be, and how robust and how well recovered. And we need to frame any money that's coming from government into supporting those really good long-term strategies, rather than a quick fix of giving people a lot of money but not really solving the affordability problem.
I'll stay with you, Orla, in terms of construction costs. I mean, we know that material costs have soared because of the Suez Canal and constriction of supply in China and so on of steel. I mean, it just seems utterly incongruous that we're bringing steel halfway across the world from China to be used in these islands, but that's the way it is. How do you make things affordable if the actual costs are soaring?
Well, I think it's important. I mean, if people are thinking of a sort of city house in Ireland that might be starting at 350,000 now, relatively speaking, the material cost of that is a fraction of it. It's not all of it. So the construction costs might be 200,000 out of that, and half of that might be labour and half might be material. So undoubtedly, we do have a problem at the moment. I suppose a really bad series of events, firstly with Brexit disrupting supply chains and increasing costs for the UK, wider issues then with transportation and disruption from the pandemic, and then on-site disruption from the pandemic, and all of that has been really difficult for people. A lot of our materials are imported, and in fact the cost in a house isn't really about the square footage. It's about all the high value things like kitchens and bathrooms and windows and doors and heating and electrics, and most of that is imported in Ireland. And the government could go a long way by using the EU procurement system, say, to put out a tender for 10,000 standard bathroom fittings to Europe and develop supply chains and supply at cost or a little bit above cost into the domestic developer market. So we could do things that don't reduce quality at all, but significantly have a better supply chain and lever the benefits of being in the European Union.
I mean, the thing about supply, and you're saying that it doesn't necessarily bring down costs, I would put it to you that if the government made available to developers a new supply chain facilitated by government, and they buy, a good quality but relatively inexpensive kitchen, the developer will see what the market will bear, and he'll make a massive profit on that kitchen when it's installed. That's what they do.
Well, that comes down to how you set up the procurement. I mean, we don't procure new hospital wings and school buildings and any other public sector project in that way. We don't look for a spec developer to build it. We itemise everything that's to be built. We competitively tender. We get the best price, and there's a contract then, and that builder is paid monthly when the work.
But this would work
so
in social housing. Where you spec the social house. You tell the developer, this is the kitchen that you can have. We will facilitate that at this price. And you can do that when you're a local council and you're doing that, or maybe even if you're a government-approved housing association. Out in the private sector, it's always the market, isn't it? They won't build if they don't think they can make a profit. And if there's any money, that comes their way via government grants or cheap land, they'll take it and they'll take the profit. That's what they do.
Well, I think that's a factor of not having enough players in the market as well. And an EU report before Christmas said that, one of the reasons Ireland is probably unaffordable at the moment is to do with the lack of competition in the market. So what I'm suggesting is if we can encourage and support new players in a small scale to get back into developing housing, we can have private spec developers, but we will have more of them and more competition. And then people will start competing on price and on quality because there are more of them in the market. At the moment, there's very little little supply feeding the market, and it is controlled at very high prices. And then we have, people saying it costs 400,000 to build a house in Dublin, but yet we have people selling the same house in Carlow or Laois or Wexford or Sligo for under 200,000 or under 250,000. So, clearly the prices in Dublin are driven by expectation and land value.
But is it land as well? Orla, is it site cost in Dublin? I mean, that's the variable, if you like. You can get the same bricks, the same blocks, the same brick layer even, the same kitchen, the same tiles, but the one variable is always the site cost.
I think it's size and expectation. The Dublin market is also inflated by people building for the rental market and expecting high prices in the rental market. And we've seen international funds buying up whole schemes, and that's obviously driving prices because they're factoring in a rent of 2,000 plus a month, and that will let them pay a certain price. The huge advantage, I would say, of Dublin and Cork and other Irish cities is that we have a lot of land compared to other cities that have a housing crisis. So we have a lot more opportunity available in how we go about this. And if, as I said, people can be building homes for 250,000 or in or around that range, an enormous number of people in the cities could afford to service their own mortgage at that without any public subsidy. So it's a case of how we do it, and also protecting people who already own their homes so that their prices don't come down suddenly. We need to protect people who already have mortgages, and we don't want to push anybody back into negative equity and how that's done either.
So, Carl, what do you think should be in the Housing for All plan?
Well, I wouldn't I agree with the affordability thing, but if you're going to make affordability the point and bring prices down, then you actually are in favour of rampant negative equity. And I would have to say that in the broad, that is roughly where we need to go. It's an uncomfortable topic, but it is actually what is required, because you can't build an affordable house in one place and next door have a really expensive one. I think the ultimate solution, or the greater solution, rather than saying, the state build or anything, that's golden era fallacy thinking. The state stopped being a good provider of homes back in the 1950s versus what the rest of the market could provide. But the solution wasn't actually who was doing the building. The solution there was that we used to tax property and tax land appropriately, and that's what funded it. And in fact, the actual idea that we need to embrace is to flood the market with state land, because the state is the biggest owner and biggest hoarder, and they can hoard for 50 and 60 years at a time. They regularly do. That should suppress the land values, but also tax land and tax housing more, and that will make holding the same thing more expensive and also provide a means to fund future development. You see, if the state owns something, they can't tax it. And for instance, like local authority rates, if a state occupies a building, those rates aren't paid. It negates it. Whereas if someone else holds that land, it does become taxable. And we need to think about this more in the way that you'd think about a farm. Like if you're growing a harvest and you're reaping it in, you can do something. If it just sits as idle, there's not much you can do. And that's really, really politically, it's kryptonite, because no one wants to hear that. They want to hear, give me a subsidy, give me some cash, entice me to do the right thing. Like if you're getting into this point where you have to seductively bring someone into doing the right thing, then chances are you might be on a failing policy with that.
Yeah, but Carl, here's the problem. So you flood the market with loads of very cheap land, state land, which you sell to all comers, or councils get it, and both get it. What is to stop the developer just not taking his cheap land and then just making a bigger profit on foot of the cheap land? I mean, won't they push to the limits of what the market can afford, not what the market might like, or what the councils could offer by way of rental? That doesn't really matter in that situation. If the developer's selling, he'll sell at the top price and he'll make a big profit on state land.
Well, look, we also tax developers too, and at least you'd have activity. But let's just say that a price of an acre is €10,000 of development land. Okay, and the developer's sitting on some of that now, and you go out and you sell an acre of land next to it for 1,000 with planning permission for houses. That automatically reduces their value of the land they're already holding. Now, whether they want to sit in that or not, the market will determine that land value that they previously paid is trash. The new land value sets the price, and then you start to tax all the land as well, so that build or not, they're having to pay. And if you make that a sort of a wonderful trade-off, where on one hand they get decent sites in good locations, the state has most of them, and they're at a good price, and you're also taxing and to tax more progressively the longer that you don't develop, well, then you're trying to create a situation that encourages the use of land. And that's where you've got to try and get past this whole idea of housing being a purely speculative asset. There is always going to be an element to that, but it shouldn't be the thing that you do. For instance, it's wrong if your house price goes up than what you make in a year. And that has happened before, and it's starting to happen again. I don't agree with it. It's ridiculous. And something has to give. The core thing that the state can control isn't to entice people by saying, I'll give you 30 grand to be a good boy or girl. It's to actually turn around and say, we set the rules, and we're making a fundamental shift to where we're going to supply ourselves with the raw materials that are required at decent prices that we can control, because we can't control prices in China of steel. We can't control all these other things. But of the things we can control, we can determine the tax policy and how to turn that into something that gets better results. And the fact is that, when we used to tax appropriately, we didn't have, it's not like we didn't have housing problems, we did, but we were a lot better at being able to provide new housing on the back of taxing property correctly than we have been since Fianna Fáil got rid of the whole scheme back in the 70s. And strangely enough, they're the ones who are coming back with all these. It was
Martin O'Donoghue's construction of the Fianna Fáil manifesto for the 1977 election, which was at the heart of many of the economic problems that followed. Orla, so Carl would say flood the market with cheap land, state-owned land. What do you say to that as a solution?
I would say that land isn't like other commodities. It's a finite resource. And one of the few levers we have left for long-term affordable housing is that the state controls and owns a lot of land. The idea of giving that into the private sector now and losing all opportunity for future affordability.
You don't lose it, by the way. That's not a fair comparison, saying you lose it.
Can I just finish the point, sorry, Carl? I think, it also, all of these, I suppose, proposals need to be really risk assessed. I mean, the housing system is a bit like the mechanism for watch. And, when people say, well, we'll just do this on tax or we'll just do this on the planning system, there's often a very poor understanding of the risks that go with that and risk mitigation to make sure that we're not causing more damage somewhere else. And we've had far too many policies, I think, where there's such as knee-jerk on one area, like deregulating apartment sizes or standards, without understanding the longer-term implications into the housing market. So when you make very small apartments everywhere in the city, what you actually do is you push people into the commuter belt, and you worsen the sprawl problems. And, so I think we need to be really careful about these kind of straightforward, what might seem like a straightforward approach to solve one problem that actually generate a whole load more that are much harder to solve.
Go on, Carl.
Sorry, I wanted to say, this idea that the state loses land when they sell it, for a start, even if they sell it or give it away at zero, they haven't lost anything because it's not making anything. It has a value somewhere, but it's not really being accounted for. So if you had 100 hectares of idle land, it provides zero housing, zero income. If you were to decide what kind of housing you wanted on that land and sell it with permission, which the state can absolutely do, it now has 1,000 houses, large income, large recurring local property tax. And you'd be surprised, because it's not, land is a finite resource, but it's not like it never comes back into use or somehow it's all gone. Like, there's nowhere in the world that has all the land gone. There's always a land market. So that's an absolute falsehood for a start. And the second more important thing is, if we don't start to utilise these idle sites that have been, in many cases, idle for 60, 70 years, and they're in areas where housing used to exist, well, then that's a massive oversight. It's actually an indictment on the way that we manage things anyway. So if they got used and providing taxation now, you can start to do better things in the future.
Now, finally, you just mentioned a lot of the ideas that have been floated, kites flown in the media, getting land from CIE, from Docklands, from the ESB, semi-state companies forgoing land, which then will be given to the Land Development Agency. They're talking about NAMA apartments being transferred to the Land Development Agency, even though they're all let at the moment through councils and housing bodies. But the idea is that if they own these, they'd have collateral for borrowing. Then there's all sorts of other ideas about grants for derelict houses. It kind of is a bit like fiddling while Rome burns, unless you get the big things right. Orla.
I think there's a real danger of just prolonging the problem and patching the problem and not solving it. We have been on a policy for the last 5 years that has clearly been unsuccessful. We need to have a proper review of that policy to see where it worked and where it didn't, rather than just moving on to a new iteration of it. The targets for the 5 years of Rebuilding Ireland have fallen far short. And in fact, if you look back at the affordability targets at the beginning of that, were apartments, new build apartments in Dublin, 2 beds for between 200 and 260,000. So over the course of that plan, we've suddenly moved up to double that. Clearly something has gone badly wrong in the levers to control affordability. I think rather than
yeah,
Can I just finish?
we'll leave it there.
Can I finish just
we'll
by
leave it
saying
there
on-
because go on, Carl, briefly.
In Rebuilding Ireland, the target and the output actually was met in 2016, 17, 18, 2019. We missed it in 2020 and we're going to miss it in 2021. Pandemic, well, I've got the printout from Rebuilding Ireland. Look, your figures are probably better than the Housing Agency, but that is something we also can't lament the things that we're doing decently on, and that's an important point to remember too.
All right, lots of comments coming in. I'll bring those to our listeners later on. Interesting comments on aspects of construction. Orla Hegarty, architect, assistant professor of the School of Architecture, Planning and Environment at UCD, and Carl Dieter, financial analyst with yes.ie. Thank you both very much.